There's a little street in Boston called Brattle Street where my parents started. To make it even more confusing, uh, that to make it even more confusing, the street doesn't exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And my father built the store and his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge. And he was also a bit of a character and a showman. And we've moved 7 times over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. But every time my father would move, he'd move the best books over to his new location and then run sales, half price, $1.50, quarter dime. But the last day, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever, ring a big bell. People go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would come in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969. And we were moving from near Boston City Hall to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I say, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. If you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Book Shop." They filled it up with books and they drove it from Boston City Hall up Court Street, down Tremont, which is where the Boston Common, and then right to West Street, which is right there, and then back down to Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic told him he could do it all morning. He was a friend, but after an hour, the city was at an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And when we moved into West Street, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire. It literally burnt to the ground. It was 100% gone. And we had essentially no insurance. We didn't even have enough insurance to pay for the demolition of the building. But we found a storefront a few doors up the street within a few weeks. We rented folding tables. People either gave us, sold us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at Boston at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, we opened within a month. The main thing was just keep going. Next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is again a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1.03 and $5. 2 floors of general use books, third floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, leather bindings. And that type of business is a dying business. And it's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but particularly in the inner cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which I can assure you are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business. And like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s, so I plan on doing this for years to come. I have daughters who are in their mid to late 30s. I don't think they plan to come into it, but I have grandchildren who are 3 or 4 years old. So all I have to do is last another 20 years and maybe they'll take it over. And I've done this literally all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I honestly don't know, but I'm sure they were talking about books all the time. And I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I do have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, my father's health wasn't that good. I needed a year off. That year now has been 50 years. And I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. And a lot of the fun of the store is the people, the characters, the going out to houses and estates. And I'll tell a few of those stories. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's even the people who work for us. I remember when my father wasn't there and I was first running the store almost 50 years ago. I hired an employee. He had been working a few days. And at that time, and what I considered an older man at the time came in and asked for a relatively obscure novelist named Donifred Yates. I knew who Doniford Yates was. We went over to the section, looked at it. We didn't have anything. At the time, we had index cards for keeping what people wanted. And I said to the man, I said, would you like to leave your name? They do come in. He said, no, no, maybe I'll just check later. He left. And my new employee comes up to me and says, does that man come in here often? And I said, well, I really wasn't paying that much attention. He goes, oh, well, that was J.D. Salinger. I used to date his daughter. You never know who's going to be in. And this employee, uh, I had one time gave an introduction one time to me and my wife that I still haven't forgotten. One of the most unusual introductions. Uh, we had four basketball tickets. My wife used to work for what she likes to term as the Boston's local professional basketball team. But we had four tickets. We said, Hugh, do you want to go to the game? And he said, sure, but let me have the tickets. I'll come in with somebody. We'll meet you there. My wife and I get uh, to the Boston Garden. He's there with a woman. He says, I'd like you to meet my wife, Mickey. We're getting divorced tomorrow. What do you say to an introduction like that? Anyways, he worked for us for another 15 years and it never changed. But one of the great parts about the business is going out to the houses and estates. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island, never knowing who you're going to meet, what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. I'll tell a few of those stories. I was out of the store, this was a while ago. A lady named Mrs. Fisher called up. She left a message. I called her up and she said, my father died in Providence. Well, Providence is only an hour away. I mean, we travel all over New England. Matter of fact, right now we're in the process of moving about 30,000 books out of an estate in Albany, New York. And, it's a physical job. 30,000, they actually have 30,000. Anyways, she said, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. Would you be interested in coming down and giving a bid? And I said, sure. I mean, again, 500 art reference books at the time sounded interesting. They lived in an old street in Providence called Benefit Street. Got to the street, a large old colonial house up near Brown University. uh, Got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. It turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought 80% of the books I wanted. I was pleased. She was happy. And she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? Well, their house in Newport was one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about that was being in one of those Newport mansions that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, come here, go here, do this, do that. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, I do hundreds of free appraisals, either on Antiques Roadshow, people calling in, email, people coming into the store, and we do them for free. But sometimes people need formal written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes. Then I discuss a fee. Any case, another mansion in Newport, not as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family, Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. And it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships, and it was fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page and it said, Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. Uh, when my father was still alive, and he died over 35 years ago, We got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like she might have a few interesting things. She lived relatively close to Boston, so we decided to go out to her house. Get to the house, little ranch house, paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you say, "Oh, gee, what's going to be here?" She answered the door. She was quite elderly. We walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. Turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution, and she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle. There was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into her house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors, sort of pastoral European scenes. When I first saw them, I thought they looked nice. The more she talked, the longer as I was there, the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, "Those 10 watercolors, they're really nice." And she sort of turned around and said, "Oh, yes, they're all Turners." So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of paintings. It's like, "Oh, yes, they're all." So you never know who the people are, who they're going to be, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday parties, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. I finally said to him, "You're 100 years old. Isn't Tokyo an awfully long way to go?" And he said, "Well, when I used to work, it took me well over 35 hours to get to Chicago." He says, "I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays." And here's a man who can tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He was obviously a much younger man at the time. And he said he was really excited of all the learning and insight he was going to get at this dinner with the two men. And he said he got to the table a little bit early. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite Ford. And this man said the first thing Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. He said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now, I can go on and on and on with these stories. Actually, I will, but maybe in a different path. But we get hundreds of phone calls at the store. Do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much is it worth? Or whatever. And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with can answer right off the top of our heads. Some are a little more involved. Occasionally, you really have to do some research, but that can be fun. But every once in a while, you get a call that really stands out. And again, this was a while ago, but I answered the phone. "Hello, Brattle Book Shop. Can I help you?" Lady, elderly, very thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Now you have to admit that gets your attention. She stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. When he was 2 and 3 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first thought. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Handwritten letters from 20th century, later 20th century presidents, particularly rare, hard to get, and valuable. She wanted to get an offer. I was skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house, great stories. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. The letters were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong, but who knows? Maybe someday I'll hear about them again. And one of the things that comes up, a lot of people ask me, what's some of the most valuable things that you've had, or or whatever. And when I said I'm going to do two stories at the end, one of them is what I consider the most valuable book, or the one that means the most to me. So I'll leave that out. But I deal with this every day. I mean, we go out to houses almost every single day. A lot of times it's people moving, they have an estate or whatever, and small to large quantities, good to not as good books. One of the things that made it easier nowadays, usually a conversation on the phone starts off, how many books do you have? And the answer is a lot. And then what kind of books do you have? Fiction and nonfiction, which is every book ever printed. And we try to narrow that down, ask some questions. But nowadays, we say, look, if they're on shelves, send us digital pictures of the shelves. We can see the books, and but we do go out constantly. But even though I do this every day, there are things that you get called into to hold, touch, or praise that just touching them is wonderful. And I'll mention a few of those. I got called by a local museum in Boston to do an appraisal of an item they had. They were just loaning it from one museum to another, so they just needed a quick insurance appraisal. And since I was a member of the museum, I said, look, I'll do it for free, but I don't want to do it from your website. I don't want to do it from a copy. I want to see and hold the original. They said, no problem, make an appointment, come in. I'm sitting there holding a 4-page account of Paul Revere's ride by Paul Revere. I mean, that even exists, that that he's describing the ride, and they told me to get off my horse or they'd blow my head off. I mean, just being able to touch and hold something like that, even though I do this, can send shivers up your spine. I mean, it's really amazing. And so that was one time when I knew what I was going out for. Another time I got called to a house just a little bit north of Boston. Didn't really get too much of a description, except they sounded like they might have a few interesting items. Um, the house was a sort of a post-World War II ranch house. Again, typical, nothing too much, a small house. Go into the house, they showed me a few shelves of books. They were nice books. And then on the kitchen table, one of these Formica 1950s tables, is this big roll of paper. It was the manuscript for On the Road, the original manuscript that he wrote Stream of Consciousness on a roll of paper. I got to pick it up. I got to touch it. I could only unroll it a few feet. It was too fragile. It turned out the person was his nephew. But totally unexpected. There it is. Now, they sold it through an auction at $2.5 million at that time. The person who bought it now sends it on tour. But to even be able to say that I walked in unexpectedly on the manuscript for On the Road and got to touch it, hold it, and so on. Now, I did mention that I was a chemistry major and I like books on science. Another university in the Boston area, I got called to ask me to come in to do an appraisal. They had some books. One of the books they had was the first edition of Principia Mathematica, done in the 1600s, of Isaac Newton's. Uh, I mean, just holding and touching a book like that, that's upwards of $1 million. But what made this one special, this was Isaac Newton's copy with his notes in the margins. It was just, I got to touch it, hold it. Now, that went from the school that it was at to MIT, and now it's at the Huntington Library. And before the pandemic, my wife and I were at the Pasadena the ABA book fair, and we went out to the Huntington Library. Now, I went and I saw it in the glass case, and I go, I got to touch that. They wouldn't let me do it now, but so one other that I'll tell that's sort of interesting, and again, sort of a little unexpected. We got called, my manager went with me. She had been working uh, to an institution. They said, look, could you come? I was friends with them. I said, fine. Went downstairs, on a folding table were a few documents. One was the Bill of Rights, the original. One was the Pilgrim Charter, And one was a declaration, a printed copy of the Declaration of Independence. It was done a year later, but it was the first one to ever have the names printed on a printed copy. Because signing that thing, if they had lost, they were all traitors. So it was a year later. But then across the top, in ink, was signed, "This is a true and authentic copy, John Hancock." I have to admit, I put my little finger on each one. It was the state archives of the state of Massachusetts. And they were going to open a museum right near the Kennedy Library, which they have done. And those are now in glass cases at the museum. But that's the type of thing that's a lot of fun. You never know what you're going to see. And I've mentioned a few times that I go out to houses and estates all the time. And again, you never know who you're going to meet there, what you're going to see. And then there are some things that can come up that are a little bit frustrating. People postpone on you. I mean, and a lot of times it's understandable. You have an appointment, health issues, daycare issues, uh, plumbing or whatever comes up. They call up the last minute, we have to postpone. And you understand, but it's like, gee, you'd blocked off that time. Usually you redo it, but it's part of business. We had a very good friend of ours, and this is a little over 20 years ago, and he was having some financial problems. And he had in one of those storage unit places, he had a storage unit with books in it. And it was actually a very nice storage unit. It actually had electricity in each unit. It was well lit. But he said, "Look, I need to sell some things. Could you come out?" And I said, "Sure, we'd be happy to." And he called and postponed, and we rescheduled, and he called and postponed, and we rescheduled, and he called and postponed. And after the fourth call and postponing, I said, "Russ, you postpone us again, and I don't care what you have in that. I am not coming." The morning of the fifth one, he calls up, he goes, "We have to postpone, but it's not my fault. It's not my fault." And what had happened was he had the storage unit, but the lady next to him was actually a very sad story. Her husband was an abusive alcoholic. He had run out on the family 20 years before. Um, the woman whose storage unit was that night was on her deathbed. And she told her daughter, "Look, I have a storage unit in Cambridge. I want you to go tomorrow. I want you to go to the storage unit. When you open the storage unit, in the storage unit is a freezer. In the freezer is your father." She had murdered him 20 years ago. Everybody thought he had run out, but she had had him in a freezer in the storage unit for 20 years. I said to Russ, "Okay, that's a good excuse." And it was on the news that night, so the police were there. So it wasn't like he was making it. Well, I don't know that you could make up a story like that. But so you never know what's going to happen. You also never know who is going to stop into the store, who are going to come in. My father, when he was in business, had this student coming in. And like the story, he was going to business school in the Boston area. And when I started in the 70s, I always have gotten to work early. And he would come in. I got to know him. He was a vice president of the bank. And if anyone's listening right now and they're vice presidents of the bank, no offense, they have lots of vice presidents. But he was with one in North Carolina, and he knew I got in early. He said, "Look, I have to go to New York every once in a while, but they have a shuttle at that time that was a very early. I can get to the store at 7 in the morning, and then I can get a 9 o'clock shuttle back to North Carolina. Would it be all right if I came in?" And he was a great guy. I said, "Sure, of course, no problem." And as a few years went on, he was an executive vice president, a senior vice president, and then his bank merged, and he was president of Bank of America. And he would still call me up and say, "Can I come in early?" And so you never know that student, what they're going to be and where they're going to go from there. Um, I'll tell a couple of quick stories about Antiques Roadshow because I can go on and on and on. People ask me, do I collect books? Not really. I grew up with a father who brought home 5, 6, 10 books a day for 30 or 40 years. You can imagine what our house looks like. I do read books, but I tend to bring them back. One collection I have um, is there's a lot of Victorian books have very nice decorative covers. And the reason they have nice decorative covers, it was before they had widely used dust jackets. Publishers figured if you saw the book um, and it caught your eye, more chance you'd buy it. And there are people who collect books like this just for the decorative covers. You can go to yard sales, bookstores, auctions, and pick these up very cheaply. Some are expensive, and individually they might not seem like much, but graphically, as a collection, they can be great. And actually, I had a collection like that myself that started as a bit of a joke. One day I got a book in and had a picture of a toilet on the cover. The title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper, invented the toilet. So anyways, I brought it home. I showed it to my wife. She looked at it and said, "We have to put this in the bathroom." So we did. Couple of days later, I got another book that had a big eye staring out of the cover. The title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but with a big eye staring at you, I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now, this was a little half bathroom, no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves. Now there were 300 or 400 of these Victorian style illustrated books in the bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback, loads of reading material. But one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable because every once in a while a book falls off the shelf and you can imagine where it ends up. Um, and my wife had a huge collection, about 1,000 or more books on jazz and roots music. Um, and she also had some really great signed 8x10 studio photos. I mean, she had one inscribed by U.B. Blake to W.C. Handy. The one she loved the most was it was of a bill, a playbill, but it was of outside a theater, but it was Louis Armstrong and then down featuring Billie Holiday, but it was inscribed to Bill, to Louis, to Lou, to Pops, who taught me everything, Billy. Uh, but we downsized and she sold the collection to somebody who really wanted it. Now she has a small collection of Anne Frank. She has about 20 copies of the Diary of Anne Frank from the first editions in Dutch through some very beautiful editions. Um, but what I collect now, and you'll never be able to see this, but I'm going to show it to you anyways, is this is a page that has a lot of writing, and then there is page after page after page of either a word, a sentence, a a, a phrase. Every single one of those is a story. And there's just hundreds. I also have them on my iPhone. And that's what I collect now. Every time something interesting comes in, I have a story to tell. Now, we did talk about rare books, and I think it might be getting close to time to do some questions or to maybe talk quickly about Roadshow. But when I tell stories about rare books and collecting, we one time got a collection of cookbooks in. We got about 2,000 cookbooks. Some of them went back to the 1700s, really good books. But there also was a box of the old pamphlets, like how to bake a chocolate company, how to make Jello, gold medal flour, all of those. They can be very colorful. They can be somewhat collectible. But I said to the people working with me, I said, look, we've got 2,000 books to deal with. Just put these out on a dollar table. There'll be plenty of time and and there'll be bargains, but let it be a bargain. 2 hours later, a man comes running in with one of the pamphlets, and it's hard to describe how beside himself he was. He was thrilled. He was going on, and I was looking for this for years and years and years, and it's only $1, and he just kept going and going, and finally I looked at the pamphlet. The title was Coconuts and Constipation. You never know what somebody's going to like. Now, again, quickly to Antiques Roadshow. I love doing Antiques Roadshow. You never know what you're going to see. You never know what people are going to bring in. But one thing that people don't realize usually about Antiques Roadshow is we don't get paid at all, anything. We don't get airfare. We don't get hotels. We don't get meals. other than a lunch when we're actually doing the show, it's public television. But what we do get, 8.5 million people watch each show. So that's fun. And also, why would I ever go to Fargo, Boise, Anchorage? I mean, I've gotten to see the country. My wife and I usually go together, and we're lucky. We can go a few days early. We can actually see the places. And anywhere you go in this country, I don't care where it is, the people are wonderful. It's beautiful if you make any effort. Don't talk about politics and religion. That's probably the best thing. But the way that show works is you appraise at whatever where they're having the show for a day. About 3,000 people come to the show. Each person has two items. So around 5 to 6,000 items come to a show. When people drive, sometimes they get tickets by lottery. Sometimes there are 3,000 tickets, but there are 36,000 people who apply. Anyways, so they've won the lottery. Some people drive 500, 1,000 miles to get to the show. They wait in the line, they come into the line, they go to triage, which is a group of appraisers who say, okay, you go to books, you go to folk art, you go to this. So then they get to the book table, and you try to look at everything, uh, and you do, and most of the things you could go junk, 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 but people have really made enough, so you actually look and so on. Now, the ideal day for an Antiques Roadshow appraiser is if someone comes in at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning and they have something interesting that they don't know that everything there is to know about it, and there's a good story, then you call over a producer. The producer talks to you, they talk to the guest separately, and they say, sure, tape it, go on. By 9:30, you've taped something. If it's 4 in the afternoon and you haven't taped, there's no guarantee that even with all the travel, all that, that you're even going to get on TV. And I remember there was one city I went to, and at about 9 in the morning, a man came in with a few things uh, and that he had from Pope John Paul, rosary beads, a few little. They weren't anything great, but then he pulled out some photographs. It turned out he was the pilot that flew the Pope and his entourage around the country in the 70s. And he started telling stories about what was going on behind the scenes. And then these 8 by 10 photos, there was one photo in there. I looked at it and I go, this is fabulous. Usually when you see a photo of someone with the Pope, it's very formal. The Pope's standing there in his vestments, person's kneeling, they kiss the ring, they get a photo. It's very formal. This picture was the pilot was in the pilot seat of the plane in his uniform. The Pope was in his vestments, but with one leg up in the air, reaching over the pilot seat, signing his Bible. And I'm going, this is great. And so I say to the man, okay, let me see the Bible. He goes, oh, I didn't bring that. And I go, can you go get it? And he goes, it's Saturday, it's in a bank vault. And I go, ah, I taped something later in the day. My wife did the Antiques Roadshow for a few years. She doesn't enjoy, she loves coming and going with me, but she doesn't enjoy standing there for 12 hours appraising. So, but she still comes, but she did it. And when you do appraisals for people, a lot of people are happy, even when you tell them their stuff isn't worth anything. Actually, most people are very happy because they go, great. Now I don't have to worry about this anymore. I can give it to the grandchildren. I can sell, I can read it. But there are some people, no matter what you do, they're not going to be happy. My wife was at a road show. Person comes in, again, she was trying to be very nice. The lady goes, I have a book signed by A. Lincoln. My wife looks at it very nicely and she goes, it is signed by A. Lincoln, but not the A. Lincoln we want it to be. And the lady goes, how can you tell? And my wife opens the book up very gently and says, well, the first clue is this book was printed in 1911. And the lady goes, so? And my wife goes, I learned in school that he was assassinated in 1865. Lady slams the book closed, says, you don't know what you're talking about, and storms off. You know, when somebody wants something to be what they want it to be, they can convince themselves. I mean, I even can do that. someone brings something in and you go, this is great. And then you go, but you're trying to convince, and that's why knowing other appraisers, you don't have to know everything. I just have to know people who do and be able to have them call. Let's get to questions. I can sort of see that's coming up.
Yeah. So Ken, one question that I know a lot of people have is your bookshop, at least the exterior, was recently featured in the Holdovers movie, but that's not the first time that your bookshop's been filmed, I
Well,
should
well, we get loads. Boston is a college town. We get lots of students who want to do their movies there. But no, uh, the Holdovers was fabulous. First of all, it's a big difference when a professional team comes in. Now we've had commercials shot there. We've had background information shot there. The Prudential Center, if any of you know it in Boston, has a View Boston. They One of the places they filmed for their introductory movie was our store. But when the holdovers approached us, um, well, they wanted to do it on a Saturday. We had to be closed. We negotiated that point. Actually, we should be closed every Saturday with what they paid us. The manager at the store, her partner, he is a location manager for movies. So we had someone we could call and say, "Does that sound right? Does this sound right?" But then they wanted to film just in our lot, which is where the store burnt down. And it was just fascinating watching a Hollywood production set up. One of the things that really struck me, the movie, for those of you who haven't seen The Holdovers, is set in the wintertime. It's the Christmas vacation. And they filmed in February, but there wasn't any snow. They went out to a shopping center. And you know how shopping centers have those big piles of snow when they plowed? And they bought snow from the pile. I never knew there was a market for snow, and they were actually happy that it was dirty because that looked more like it had been. So they wheelbarrowed in snow to the front of the store. But they spent a day, everybody, the extras, the crew, the director, Paul Giamatti, who's the star, was wonderful. A matter of fact, was great. He came back the next 2 or 3 days and actually shopped and bought books, and we talked with him, and it was just great. And then you go to the movie and you go, I wonder if they cut the scene, but obviously they didn't. And now we're wondering, do we get an Academy Award too if they win? But somehow I don't think that's going to happen. But so he bought books. He's a big book collector. Uh, my wife joked with him. She said, I one time applied for a job that your father had. My wife, Paul Giamatti's father, not only was the president of Yale, but he was the commissioner of baseball. And my wife, when one commissioner was retiring, she sent in an application. She said, look, I'll do this and I'll work for half. At the time, the salary was 24 million. She said she worked, she never got a response though. In any case, more questions.
Yeah, so you obviously you've got a brick and mortar bookshop, but the a lot of booksellers have moved online. And we've seen a lot of small independent bookshops close. What do you think is going to happen with the business? What do you think the model of book selling is going to be?
Well, first of all, there are in a lot of the towns and cities, not only new but used bookstores, a lot of them now are reopening. They're not the same stores, but people are opening smaller stores because people like the service. They like the knowing the person. They like shopping. They like coming in. Also, a lot of the smaller stores in rural areas will, their stock will be towards that area and make people come in. Now, in the inner cities, the big problem is real estate, to be quite honest. Again, the property values. Um, it, I actually, that's a concern with me, is the property is worth way, way more than the business is worth. And so like I say, I have to last that 20 years, have my grandchildren take over, and then they can inherit the building too. But that's the bigger problem with opening the businesses is real estate rent. Also, I get loads of people coming to me and say, I'd love to open a bookstore. It sounds so great. I mean, I love books. I love, talking with people about books. And one of the first things I say to them, this is a business. You've got to make money. It's not about the loving. I mean, yes, it is about the getting exciting and loving, but I also tell people it's an incredibly physical business, at least having a general used bookstore. You buy 1,000 books in a fifth floor walk-up in 95-degree weather, and you've got to carry 1,000 books out of a fifth floor walk-up in 95-degree weather. Now, if anyone's thinking of applying for a job at the Brattle Book Shop, I can tell you how the interview starts off. The first question is, do you have any old injuries, football, sports, athletic, back, knees, elbows, anything like that? The next question is, do you have any allergies to dust, mold, mildew? Once you get through those questions, then we will ask, well, where did you go to school? What's your background? Why do you want to work in a bookstore? But it's really a physical business. But I also encourage people because it's a lot of fun. The other thing about used and rare bookstores is even the largest of the used and rare bookstores are tiny, tiny businesses on the scale of American business. And so every store tends to take on the personality of the owner and to some degree. And whether that owner wants to be in an office selling books on just the history of science or just 20th century first editions, or maybe they want to deal out of their basement, selling some obscure uh, item uh, and never see anybody. Uh, that's up to the person and the owner. And when people collect books, one of the things they oftentimes ask me is, how do you know that you're getting a fair deal? How do you know especially when they're first starting out? And I said, if I talk to a customer and or a collector, and they've been collecting for 30, 40 years, and they say, I've never made a mistake, immediately I'll say that's the biggest mistake you probably ever made because it means you've never taken a chance. You've never bought that item that you're not sure about. And quite honestly, people remember the one that got away, just like the fish that, but if you take chances, first of all, if you make a mistake, you try not to. You obviously try to be right on everything, but you learn from your mistakes. Uh, Also, as you go around to bookstores, to auctions, to sales, to whatever, you get to know the people and you start forming relationships and you start learning. Well, okay, if this person says this is in this condition, I'm going to get it in about that condition. Whereas if this person says it, it's going to be exactly what they say. And so you sum it up when you're looking at the price. Uh, if someone says this is signed or so on, you might say, well, I better have someone else double check everything they're saying. Whereas I know this person, if they make a mistake even 20 years from now, they'll be good for it. So you form relationships and then you get to know the people and they know what you're looking for. And they know, they might call you when they get in what you want. Another thing that comes up on that people ask me a lot is bargaining. Should I bargain? And my answer to that is there was a bookstore in California. It's still there in a smaller scale called Heritage Bookshop. And it was owned by the Lou and Ben Weinstein. And they told me once what they did with people, and it makes sense. Someone will come in that they've never seen before that wants to collect. They find a book for them. The person says, yeah, but what can you do for me? And Lou told me many times what he'd say. He says, I can definitely give you 20% off. He says, but you also have to realize I have 4 or 5 people who collect the same thing that you collect. And if you're going to be asking me for these big discounts every time, I'm happy to call you fifth. No, he said the reality is when a person became a good customer and there was always some back and forth but he said that sort of put a little bit of a stop and he'd see how uh, serious people were. But a lot of bargaining comes down to how you say it, how nice you say it, what you're buying. whether you seem sincere, whether the person likes you. I mean, we have people at the store who will throw a book down and go, I'll give you $10 for that. And I don't care if it was marked $8. I'd say no. And then you have other people who bought a whole stack of books and they go, oh, I just don't have quite enough. Is there any way you could, and you almost want to give it to them. Or especially if little kids are involved, then sometimes you say, hey, well, you get them hooked. Uh, the first, but so bargaining, that's something that people talk about. I also tell people who want to start a store, one of the things that they say, we've collected books for years and years, and we've got a lot of things and, a stock. And I said, well, that works great for the first couple of months. And then you sell that stock and you might be doing fabulously well. But think about, you've got to replace the stock. Really used bookstores and secondhand and rare bookstores, the way they make money is not necessarily selling the books. They make money buying the books to have so that you can buy them from us. Um, and so that's something also to take into account. But I also try to encourage people because you meet wonderful people, you get to know things, you run into things you'd never ever think about running into. The characters who are in the trade, the characters who collect, they're fabulous. And so I encourage it. And I also say when you're first starting out, ask questions. Go to book fairs, go to that, ask questions. Usually the problem when you ask someone who loves what they do a question, it's not getting them to answer you, it's getting them to stop answering. So in any case, that's it. Um, and like I say, well, one thing I will say before we get to the end, I can tell stories. Like I say, I've got hundreds of. I could put my sheet of paper on a wall and throw dots at it and just do stories from that. But I do a podcast called Brattlecast. I have about 150 20-minute episodes. I put a new one out every 2 weeks. So if you like the stories, look for Apple, any of the servers, uh, Google Brattlecast, more stories. Any more questions?
I don't see any.
Well, there was one that someone asked, um, and they were asking, do famous people come in?
Mhm.
Uh, Sure, we have, every once in a while get famous people coming in. Uh, the Michelle Williams, who's a big movie actress, came in once with her child. My manager helped her find some children's books. We gave her a tote bag. She was very, very nice. But about a year later, someone was in an airport, a friend of ours, and took a picture of her. And she had our tote boy bag over her shoulder. So that was nice. A few years ago, I came into the store and they said, Johnny Depp's upstairs. And so I went up and I met him and he was buying books. He was with his to-be wife, Amber Heard. That didn't work out so well. But one of the things though, he was there and I said, John, I said to him, I've got a really good story that you'd like to hear. And he said, well, what is this? And he had a few people with him in the back. And I said, well, I got a call once to go to a convent to look at books. And these were nuns that were still in habit and so on. And few of them were fairly young, and I went down to the library, and on the library wall were posters of Edward Scissorhands and other posters of his movies. And I went into the nun, and again, she was probably in her 30s, but full habit, and you're expecting things to be really serious. And I said, "You've got posters of Johnny Depp." She goes, "We love Johnny Depp. We go to all his movies. It's just." And she says, "The other one we really love is we go to all the James Bond movies." And she says, "And we can't wait till in the movie he says, Bond, James Bond." And so I told Johnny Depp that these nuns really, I was trying to convince him he should go to the convent. His too scheduled, but he told his whole entourage and all of that. And then when he came downstairs, we had a, a kid working for us who was in high school at the time. And he goes, Johnny Depp took a picture with a few of our employees that I have. And this uh, person said, because Amber Heard was a child star, and he said, "Can I have a picture with you?" And and she said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And Johnny Depp came over to get in the picture. And my employee goes, "I don't want you in the picture." He goes, "I just want," and he said, "Okay." So you get people. Now, one story we have of a movie actor who came in. Uh, this was me in part, but there was a movie actor, maybe a lot of you know him, maybe you don't, whose name was Carl Malden. And he was a very well-known, he co-starred with Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and he did a TV series called Streets of San Francisco. He was very, very nice. He was in doing a commercial. He was in 2 or 3 days. We talked with him, and he said, when I first came into your father's store, it was a long time ago. Me and Marlon, they had previews for Streetcar Named Desire in Boston before it opened in New York. And he said, and we used to come into your father's store all the time. I go, "You and Marlon Brando came in?" And he said, "Yeah, we came in all." And I said, "My father never ever, he might not have recognized you." And so it was like, can you imagine Marlon Brando coming into the store in the afternoons and my father not even recognizing the fact? One last person I'll say on that type of story is we also had a baseball player who came into the store. For those of you who know baseball to some degree, his name was Mo Berg. He was a catcher during the 30s. He played for the Red Sox and a few other teams, but he was a character. And it was in my teen years up to about when I was in college. And we used to go out to dinner with him all the time. But Moberg was a professional baseball player. He was a catcher, uh, but he went to Princeton. He graduated summa cum laude. He took the bar exam, got the highest grade ever recorded at the time. He could speak 15 or 20 languages, but not only could he speak languages, but he could speak in the dialect of the area of the country that he was from. And whenever we'd go to dinner, if he sensed a wait person or so on was from another country, he'd speak to them in their language. Every single one of them said, "Oh, where are you from in this country?" And beyond that, during World War II, he was a spy. And before World War II, baseball sent a baseball team with Babe Ruth and a number of the players to Japan, and Mo Berg was part of that team. And not only did he go as part of the team, but he also broadcast in Japanese.
Oh,
But what he also did while he was there, the tallest building at the time in Japan, in Tokyo, was the hospital. He went to the top of the hospital to the roof, and he filmed all of Tokyo from the roof of the and brought back that data. But during the war, and I think we're the only ones that, as far as I know, he told us, but it was confirmed. His mission, he was to find out if Germany was inventing the atomic bomb. And he said he even met with Einstein, and he said it was interesting because Einstein had an Atlantic Monthly on his desk, and Einstein had written an article, and Mo Berg had written an article about pitches and catches. Einstein said to him, "You teach me about pitches and catches, I'll teach you about nuclear power." And he did, but Moberg went to Germany, dressed up as a German officer, could speak the language so well that nobody questioned it. He went to lectures by Heisenberg, who was the leading uh, nuclear scientist. His assignment was if Heisenberg was inventing the bomb to assassinate him. He found out they weren't. They called him back because they were afraid if he got caught, he knew about the bomb. And so I was more interested that he was a baseball player at the time. But so again, I'll tell you what, we're getting a little bit further along. I'm going to tell my last two stories.
okay.
And then again, if people, and I'll say this before the end, if people have any follow-up questions, any appraisal questions, if you're ever in Boston, definitely come in, but you can email, call, uh, and whatever, and we love answering questions. But my last two stories, one is a lot of times I get asked, what's the most valuable, or what's the book that means the most to you? And it actually is a hard question. And I one time was listening to a colleague of mine answer it, and he answered it in a similar way. And I said, look, when I do talks, can I use essentially this answer? And he said, yeah, sure, of course. And, again, I talk about books, Gutenberg Bible pages, Audubon folios, all of that. But there's a 1970s or 80s, very nicely illustrated edition of The Night Before Christmas. Um, it's a very nice edition, but that edition of The Night Before Christmas, I have read to my daughters every single Christmas Eve since they've been born. Now I read it to my grandchildren. Now, to the extent where one of my daughters is married to a man from Texas. Now, I think they're very smart. They live in the Boston area. But a lot of times Christmas, they go down to Texas for Christmas. Uh, and before FaceTime, I actually recorded me reading The Night Before Christmas on YouTube. So my daughter at Christmas Eve could do it. Now I can do it with FaceTime. My other daughter lives in Nairobi, and she has a son. And Christmas Eve, although now I have to figure that Christmas Eve is actually at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and my grandson's 2 years old and goes to bed at 7. So at about 11 in the morning, I have to get on FaceTime and read The Night Before Christmas to him and my daughter and her husband. That copy of The Night Before Christmas is more valuable to me, means more to me than any other book I have. And matter of fact, my daughter who lives in the Boston area keeps it. So she says, so I won't sell it or so I won't lose it. But that means more. And the last story that I like talking about is Bibles. And the reason I like to talk about Bibles is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, probably always will be. And we get sometimes 5 and 10 calls a week with people who have 100, 200-year-old family Bible. And in most cases, we have to say to them, if this is your family Bible, sentimentally, this is priceless. Monetarily, maybe not so much. Now, if it's one of those big, huge family Bibles from the mid to later 1800s, mint condition, a few $100s, they make wonderful gifts for ministries, divinity students, whatever. But that's it. Break a class, break a hinge, they lose that value. Sometimes in the beginning, middle, or end, there's family records. The local historical genealogical society, they usually just want to digitally copy the title page, the records, and whatever. They don't want the whole big old Bible. Matter of fact, I know a historical society that someone offered to them Paul Revere's Bible. I mean, he actually signed it, and they said, no, we don't want it. And the reason they said no was all it was signed. There was no, if he had written notes in it, they would have grabbed. They said no, because Bibles take up so much room. Unless there's historical importance, we can't. Now, they made sure it ended up at the Paul Revere Museum house, where it's a great display item. So it wasn't like they just dismissed us. But in any case, I got called to a large old church in Boston, well over 100-year-old church. They wanted me in to appraise their library, or at least see if they had anything valuable. Over the well over 100 years, they had a huge library. I spent a day there, and they had a lot of really nice books. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, can you come down the basement? A few more books. Went down the basement, a few more books. And then over in a corner was a closet. Actually, it was more like a small room. The priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest. I said, what is this? And he says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't know what to do? They come to the church, they present it to the church, and what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, put it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That would just be terrible. So I use it as an example to say, if you want to donate something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, it's great. If not, you're not doing anyone a favor. Like I said, I've run a few minutes over. I can go on and on and on, but since I do work only half a day, and I am going to be here at 5:30 tomorrow morning. Why don't I end it there? But any follow-ups, anytime, like I say, ask a person who loves what they do a question and just try to get them to stop answering.
And thank you so much.
Well,
And I also thank my predecessor, Charlene Cole, for making the initial contact and helping to set this up. Thank you. It has been a fascinating evening. Everybody, glad you could be part of it and listen to these fascinating stories.
well, like I say, the Brattlecast has lots of them. But if any of you are in the Boston area at some point, call, come in. If I'm here, I'd be happy to show you through and around and talk about books. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ken.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.